Here she paused. I had the sense she might be ready to bury Nicholson, but it wasn't a corner she would turn all at once. You know, I warned him something like this could happen. Something like what, Mara? Sampson asked. Be a little more specific. He's been blackmailing clients of the club. It was supposed to be our new life money. That's what Tony always called it. Some new life, right? She gestured around the room. This is it? What about names? Dead names, made-up ones, whatever you heard. What do you know about the people he was blackmailing? Mara Kelly was warming to this, and as she did, her tone got more bitter and sarcastic. I know that he always covered his bases both sides of the aisle. That way, if anyone talks, everyone loses. And if anything happened to Tony, I was supposed to blow the whole thing wide open. She sat back and crossed her slender arms. That was the idea, anyway. That was the threat he made to the dumbasses he was blackmailing for getting a little nookie. And everyone paid up? Sampson asked her. Her eyes traveled around the room again like she couldn't believe she was here, that it had all come to this. Well, if that was true, we wouldn't be having this conversation now, would we? Chapter 64. It didn't take long for Tony Nicholson to start talking a blue streak about the club and the blackmail scheme after that. I'd seen it so many times before, the way suspects will start competing with each other once they sense the ground is shifting. To hear him tell it, Mara Kelly had set up the entire back end. Asian underground banking, public key cryptography, everything they needed to stay out of reach for as long as they had.
Why do you think they came after her too?
He kept asking us.
Don't be fooled by the pretty face. That bitch isn't nearly as stupid as she appears.
I guess you could say those two were no longer an item. Now things might get interesting. Nicholson had been sitting on the same rickety folding chair for hours, with his injured leg stuck out to the side in an immobilizer. From the twisted look on his face, he was coming due for a pain pill. Okay, I said. That's a start, Tony. Now let's talk about the real reason we're here. I took out a file and started laying photos on the table. Timothy O'Neill, Catherine Tenencourt, Renata Cruz, Caroline Cross. There was a moment of genuine surprise on his face, but just a moment. Nicholson was cool under fire.
What about them?
They all worked for you.
It's possible. A lot of people work for me.
It wasn't a question. I pointed at Caroline's picture. She was found mutilated beyond recognition. Did you catch that on camera too, Nicholson?
I seriously don't know what you're talking about. I've no idea what you're getting at. Try making sense when you bother to open your mouth.
How did she die? Something seemed to click suddenly, like a spark in Nicholson's eyes. He looked down at the picture and then back up at me.
You said Caroline Cross. That's your name, innit?
When I didn't answer, his mouth spread into a grin.
Excuse me, detective, but I think maybe you're in over your head.
I got up very fast. If the table hadn't been bolted to the floor, I might have pinned Nicholson to the far wall with it. But Sampson got to him first. He shot around the table and pulled the chair right out from under him. Nicholson flopped onto the floor like a caught fish. He started to scream.
My leg! My goddamn leg, you bastards! I'll sue you both!
Sampson didn't seem to hear. You know Virginia's a death penalty state, right?
What is this? Abu fucking Ghraib? Get the hell away from me!
Nicholson gritted his teeth and pounded the floor.
I didn't kill anyone.
But you know who did, I shouted back.
What if I had anything to trade? Don't you think I'd use it? Help me up, you stupid arseholes! Help me up here! Hey! Hey!
We walked out instead. And while we were at it, we took the chairs with us. Chapter 65. 4 hours later, in the name of coming clean and telling us what he knew, and most of all, Getting the best deal he possibly could, Nicholson offered up access to a safe deposit box in D.C. He said it contained evidence that could help us. I had doubts, but decided to take my progress with him incrementally. It took some scrambling, but by the next morning, Sampson and I were outside the Exeter Bank on Connecticut with fully executed paperwork, a key from Nicholson's desk, and 2 empty briefcases, in case there really was evidence to retrieve. This place was no ordinary savings and loan, starting with the fact that we had to be buzzed in from the street. The lobby had a do-not-touch kind of feel to it, not a pamphlet or a deposit slip in sight. From the reception desk, we were directed up to a row of glass-walled offices on the mezzanine. A woman inside one of them put down her phone and turned to look at us as we started up the stairs. Sampson smiled and waved at her. "Feels like a damn James Bond movie," he said through his teeth. "Come in, Dr. Cross. We've been expecting you." The branch manager, Christine Curry, was indeed expecting us. Her brief smile and handshake were about as warm as yesterday's oatmeal. "This is all a bit irregular for us," she said. Her accent was stuffy and British, and more upper crust than Nicholson's. "I do hope it can be done quietly. Can it be, detectives?" "Of course," I told her. I think we both wanted the same thing, for Sampson and me to be back on the street as soon as possible. Once Ms. Curry had satisfied herself with our paperwork and compared Nicholson's signature in a half a dozen places, she led us out to an elevator at the back of the mezzanine. We got on and started down, a very rapid descent. "You guys do free checking?" Sampson asked. I just stared straight ahead, didn't say a word. Stuffy environments sometimes set John off. Stuffy people, too. But most of all, bad people, criminals, and anybody who aids and abets. We came out into a small anteroom. There was an armed guard by the only other door, and a suit and tie employee at an oversized desk. Ms. Curry logged us in herself, then took us straight through to the safe deposit room. Nicholson's box, number 1665, was one of the larger ones at the back. After we'd both keyed the flap door, Ms. Curry pulled out a long rectangular drawer, then carried it to one of the viewing rooms off an adjacent hallway. "I'll just be outside whenever you're ready," she said in a way that sounded a lot like, "Don't take too long with this." We didn't. Inside the box, we found 36 discs, each one in its own plastic sleeve and dated by hand in black marker. There were also 2 leather binders filled with handwritten pages of notes, lists, addresses, and ledgers. A few minutes later, we left with all of it in our briefcases. "God bless Tony Nicholson," I said to the unflappable Ms. Curry. Chapter 66. For the rest of the afternoon, Sampson and I holed up in my office with a pair of laptops. We stayed busy watching and cataloging the extracurricular sex lives of the rich and mostly famous. It was surprisingly repetitive stuff, especially given everything that Tony Nicholson was set up to provide at the club. The roster of power players, on the other hand, was one big holy shit after another. At least half the faces were recognizable, the kind of people you'd see at a presidential inauguration, in the front row. The clients weren't just men either. Women were outnumbered about 20-1, but they were there, including a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I had to keep reminding myself that every one of these people was, at least technically, a murder suspect. We set up a log, using the date stamps embedded on each recording. For every clip, we wrote down the name of the clients we recognized and flagged the ones we didn't. I also made a note of where each scene took place at the club. My primary interest was the apartment over the carriage barn, which I'd come to think of as a kind of ground zero for this whole nasty murder puzzle. And that's where we started to pick up some legitimate momentum. Right around the time I thought my eyes were going to burn out of my head, I started to notice an interesting pattern in the tapes. "John, Let me see what you got so far. I want to check something. All of our notes were handwritten at this point, so I laid the pages out side by side and started scanning. Here, here, here. Every time I saw someone had used the apartment, I circled the date in red pen, ticking off entries as I went. Then I went back over everything I'd circled. See this? They were using the studio in the back pretty regularly for a while, and then, about 6 months ago, it just stops cold. No more parties back there. So what happened 6 months ago? Sampson asked. The question was more rhetorical than anything, since we both knew the answer. That's when the killing started. In which case, where were the rest of Nicholson's discs? Chapter 67. After work, I picked up some Thai food on 7th and brought it to Bree at the hospital. It wasn't the kind of dinner date she deserved, but anything besides Swiss steak and Jell-O from the cafeteria had to be a big improvement. It looked like she had a whole mobile office thing going on, with her laptop and a little printer and files spread out on the counter in the back. The laptop was open to WebMD, and she was busily taking notes when I came in. Who ordered the Penang curry and pad thai? I called from the doorway. That would be me, Bree said. She picked her way past all the equipment and gave me a kiss hello. How's our girl been doing? I asked. Still fighting. She's amazing. She really is. Nana looked a little more peaceful, maybe, but otherwise seemed about the same. Dr. Englefield had already warned us not to get too invested in the minutiae. You could drive yourself crazy scrutinizing every little tick and twitch when the important thing was to keep showing up and never lose hope. While I unpacked the food, Bree caught me up on the day. Englefield wanted to keep Nana on beta blockers for the time being. Her heart was still weak, but it was steady for what that was worth. And they were going to take the dialysis down to 3 times a day. There's a new resident, Dr. Abington, you should talk to about that, Bree said. I've got her number right here. I traded a plate of food and a bottle of water for it. You're doing too much, I told Bree. This is the closest thing I've ever had to a real family, she said. You know that, don't you? I did. Bree's mother died when she was 5, and her father never expressed much interest in his children after that. She'd been raised by a series of cousins more than anything, and when she left home at 17, she never looked back. All the same, I told her, you can't take off from work indefinitely. Sweetie, listen to me. I hate that this is happening. There's nothing good about it. But as long as this is the deal, then I am right where I want to be. End of story, okay? I'm fine with it. She twirled up a forkful of rice noodles and popped them into her mouth, with a grin I hadn't seen in a while. Besides, what are they going to do at work? Replace me? I'm too good for that. I couldn't argue there. Honestly, I'm not sure I could have done everything Bree was doing. Maybe I'm not that generous. But I do know that she made me feel lucky and incredibly grateful. There was never going to be enough I could do to thank her for this, but Bree didn't seem to want any payback. We spent the rest of the evening with Nana, reading out loud from Another Country, an old favorite of hers. Then around 10 o'clock, we kissed her goodnight, and for the first time since this had happened, I went home to sleep in my own bed, right next to Bree, where I belonged. Chapter 68. When Ned Mahoney called me the next day and said I should meet him at the Hirschhorn Sculpture Garden, I didn't question it for a single moment. I left the office right away and marched over there. The beat goes on, in double time. Now what does Ned want? What has he found out? He was waiting on one of the low cement walls when I came down the ramp from the mall side. Before I even reached him, he was up and walking, and when I did come alongside, he started briefing me without so much as a hello. I knew Ned well enough to understand when I should just shut up and listen. Apparently, the Bureau had already secured an administrative